Children are a nation's most precious resource, and all deserve having the best start to help them live full and meaningful lives. At some time or another, all children are unwell, but some have additional needs. 21st century child health care is exemplified by that of Northampton, United Kingdom. Here, a range of different units working together provide excellent care for an integrated children's department. For children with more complex needs, other provisions such as educational support also has an important role. Until recently, historians of paediatrics have generally assumed that paediatrics as a specialised branch of medicine had no real existence before the middle of the 19th century. Of course, this is only true if we equate paediatrics here with specialised children's hospitals and with professional organisations. But it's clear from earlier surviving archival records, such as those held at Northampton, that hospital paediatrics has a much longer history, and that hospital child health care was occurring, and in large numbers. Reconstructing the history of what might be called paediatrics before paediatricians is what this brief film will demonstrate.
The archive at Northampton General Hospital allows us to reconstruct the 18th century child inpatient and outpatient journey. On the opening day of the infirmary on March the 29th, 1744, the first patient was a child, Thomasin Grace. She was 13 years old and had scald head. After 100 days of inpatient stay, she was discharged cured.
The original infirmary building was a rented house in George Row, adjacent to the county jail. Reverend Malcolm Deacon gives the background.
From 1720, voluntary infirmaries began to be established to care for a neglected section of the population. For Northampton, the principal mover was the Reverend Dr. Philip Doddridge, who had seen many die in the town's smallpox epidemic of 1740. In 1743, he led the way at Castle Hill Church with an inspiring sermon which was published and widely circulated.
The only plausible objections which I remember to have heard against it are these two: that the distant parts of the county can expect little benefit by it, and that any private house, which can be taken for the purposes of a county hospital, can bear but little proportion to what the necessities of so large a county will require. But I hope neither of these objections will be found unanswerable, and if every objector will do his part in removing them, I am sure they cannot be found so.
When Dr. Sir James Stonehouse started at Northampton in that year, he was greatly influenced by Doddridge's preaching and writings, eventually becoming a clergyman himself. The two became firm friends and allies, working strenuously, obtaining the support of the local newspaper editor, and urging men of influence and means to generously support this glorious undertaking. Within a year, £750 was raised, sufficient to open, equip and staff a building in George Row as the town's first hospital. It was formally opened on the 29th of March, 1744.
A group of children and their families reenacted the first day of the infirmary at the original building. Regan Munnelly was made up as Thomasin Grace.
When the Northampton General Infirmary first opened, it had 30 beds. However, in spite of several extensions, the building was just not big enough to meet the demand. The infirmary moved to new purpose-built premises in 1793.
Nowadays, any sick UK child is treated for free, but in 1744 you could only be treated with a letter from a hospital subscriber. The rules actually excluded inpatient admission of children under 7 years of age. Anyone with an infectious distemper, including smallpox, was also excluded. In Northampton, in its first year of opening, over a quarter of patients were under 16 years of age.
Ward conditions were austere, as shown in this Northampton Infirmary print from 1745. The wards were lit by candlelight, and sanitation was patients using chamber pots, which were poured into a large tub at the end of the ward.
A large part of the old infirmary still survives in the present buildings complex. Although considered spacious in the mid-18th century, the configuration of accommodation inevitably gave rise to severe crowding. The main staircase also was problematic insofar as it gave access to the wards on the first and second floor levels. Also, people with infirmity were also found it very difficult to use that staircase.
The patient experience was very different then. Patients were expected to help with the general ward duties, such as cleaning and washing. They were also strongly encouraged to teach reading and writing to those who could not. There were daily religious readings too. Failure to behave properly would mean discharge and never, under any circumstances, being seen again by the infirmary. The first matron was Mrs. Esther White, paid £10 a year. And yes, she really did have absolute authority. Nowadays, the press has a field day concerning hospital food. Mrs. Thornton, what was the food like in 1744?
Inpatient hospital diets, then and now, are mainstays of effective patient treatment. In the mid-18th century, there were 4 prescribed diets at Northampton: full, milk, dry and low. Thomasin would most likely have been given the milk diet, but use of the full diet cannot be excluded either.
So, in 1744, at the Northampton General Infirmary, inpatients were given prescribed cooked hospital meals as an essential part of their treatment. Of course, what we all want to know is, what was food in 1744 really like? To find out, we reconstructed the meals from the original prescribed infirmary recipes. Some Northampton children volunteered to try out these different hospital diets. Let's hear what they have to say.
Can I have some more, please?
Don't be greedy, Tom. I want some too.
It is not added and my mum put in. He asked me some. Mum's is definitely the best.
It's not that bad. I like it too.
I don't want this every day.
Speak for yourself.
It's all pretty much the same. I don't mind though.
I'm bored already.
I don't mind.
It's not bad at all.
You need to eat good food every day.
When I grow up, my children will eat good food.
Well, they clearly liked it. So how effective was this diet?
We undertook a full dietetic analysis, and the results show that for Thomasin, the 1744 milk and full diets met the current advised nutritional requirements for adequate dietary intake. This challenges assumptions that hospital diets were historically inadequate.
So what were children admitted for? Well, the real reason for admission was because of chronic poverty and malnourishment. This was a very different time than now. In the 18th century, child death rates were extremely high. In London, out of every 1,000 newborn children, more than 400 would be expected to have died before they reached their first birthday. Today, that figure is nearer 5 in 1,000. The first patient, Thomasin Grace, had had scald head. A professional makeup artist, Julia Hyland, made up Regan from Northampton to recreate this condition. Thomasin Grace had had scald head for 11 of her 13 years. Dr. Wu, what does that mean?
Today we know scald head as ringworm. Perhaps scald head is a more accurate term in what it means for the patient. Ringworm can be particularly unpleasant and disfiguring. One can only imagine Thomasin suffering over so many years.
And Thomasin had had this for 11 years.
This is a sad story. Nowadays, we would strongly consider making a child protection referral on that factor alone. The good news is treatment is simple. Of course, we have antifungal medication available now. However, as always, cleanliness and a good balanced diet with nutrients and vitamins are essential to recovery, particularly when the patient has chronic nutritional deficiency.
But what about some other children who were treated as in or outpatients in the first year of the infirmary? Mary Connor, 2-year-old asthmatic, relieved. And Joss Furness, a 13-year-old boy who had an 11-year history of epileptic seizures. He was discharged incurable a short time later. Elizabeth Ager, admitted with 1-month history of fever. Discharged, cured. None of these outcomes was different then than it would be today. Elizabeth's case is interesting because she was admitted against medical regulations, already showing that from very early days child healthcare boundaries were moving. It would have surely helped having the Reverend Philip Doddridge personally recommending your admission. Long hospital stays measured in months, ample quantities of nutritionally sufficient food and a much cleaner environment would have made a big difference in the treatment of chronically malnourished bodies. Non-medical treatments such as enemas and bleeding were routine. So what kind of medicines were used? Well, the hospital pharmacopoeia has survived and its Latin prescriptions include mercury and arsenic. The hospital also had an extensive herb garden. We also have surviving patient literature for the 18th century. Stonehouse's book, Friendly Advice to a Patient, emphasised the charitable nature of the care. Patients were too poor to afford their own health care and were also under the afflicting hand of God. This latter remark emphasised the strong religious core underpinning the foundation of the infirmary. It also emphasised that patients should assist with any ward duties as well as teaching others to read and write. This handbook was read widely in English voluntary hospitals well into the 19th century. The surviving financial records from 1746 show the weekly cost of drugs was about on average 9p, so the entire weekly cost per patient was 6 shillings. With every inpatient being calculated to stay for about 12 weeks, the total inpatient expense was £3 12 shillings. Here we see the first list of published accounts requiring material and infrastructure that is no longer needed in current healthcare, such as sweating chairs and windmills. The first patient is always special. So what happened to Thomasin Grace? Well, after her discharge, she would have had to go back to her parish, Stoke Bruin, and give a public show of thanks. We know that she was readmitted in 1746 with a fractured arm and pelvis. Thomasin then moved to London, and there in Shoreditch, on the 17th of May 1762, aged 31 years, she married John Green. Here is her marriage register entry, and you can see that she signed her name. This is a most unusual accomplishment from a background of such extreme poverty such as hers. Could Thomasin have learned to write as an inpatient during her 2 inpatient stays at Northampton General Infirmary? Thomasin died in London in 1802, aged 71 years. We have no record of any children. So, children have been treated from the very first day in 1744 at Northampton General Infirmary, more than 100 years before the opening of specialist children's hospitals. Children are still treated there, and hopefully for further centuries to come. We shall leave the final word to the Reverend Dr. Philip Doddridge, whose inspirational sermon in 1743 ensured the founding of the infirmary, which became the Northampton General Hospital.
So I would hope that in this place, when our children and our grandchildren are in their graves, their remotest descendants which arise in their stead, and God only knows what revolutions may bring them in need of it, may have cause to reflect on this year, 1743, as the happy era of an establishment to which many around them may owe their health, their comfort, their usefulness, and possibly under God, their Christian principles and their immortal hopes. Whatever streams may in the meantime have flown into it, and God grant that they shall be as large as shall be needed, the fountain will be traced up hither. and blessings will be pronounced on them who have opened to these refreshing and healing waters. So free and so pleasant a course.